April 1945. A cold wind moves across the ruins of a once busy German market town, carrying the distant echo of artillery that has finally fallen silent. The war is ending, but the air still feels tense, as if every shattered window and collapsed rooftop is holding its breath. Near the steps of an abandoned schoolhouse, a small group of German nurses stands in a rigid line. Their white aprons are gray with soot. Their eyes are sunken, alert, waiting for whatever comes next. They have been captured only hours earlier, pulled from a field hospital overwhelmed by retreating units and broken supply lines. They expect interrogation. They expect humiliation. Some expect violence. Every lesson they were raised on, every poster, every radio broadcast told them that American soldiers were brutal, immoral, and merciless. And now, with their hands shaking behind their backs, they brace for that moment to become real. But the first figures to approach are not male soldiers at all. They are American women, uniformed, steady, carrying small canvas supply bags. And instead of shouting commands, one of them reaches in her pocket, pauses, and quietly offers a tube of lipstick. A gesture so ordinary, yet so impossible, that the nurses do not move. To understand why a simple tube of lipstick could leave trained medical personnel speechless, we must step back into the final months of the European War, a time when Germany's collapse was not only military, but psychological, social, and deeply personal. By early 1945, the German Medical Corps was stretched far beyond its limits. Field hospitals were constantly on the move, relocating from shattered towns to hastily prepared shelters, often operating in barns, cellars, or half-destroyed administrative buildings. Nurses, many barely out of training, worked under bombardment, treating soldiers whose wounds were far beyond the capabilities of small mobile units. Supplies vanished faster than they arrived. Analgesics ran out. Bandages were washed and reused. Blood plasma became a luxury almost no unit possessed. Yet despite this desperation, one belief remained intact. American forces were supposedly dangerous, vindictive, and morally corrupt. That message was not accidental. Nazi propaganda ministries had spent years constructing an image of Americans as criminals, exploiters, and predators. Posters warned women that if captured, they would face degradation. Officers repeated the stories. Civilians whispered them. By 1945, fear was not a byproduct of war. It was a structured doctrine. So when German nurses found themselves surrounded by U.S. troops, the shock was not simply due to defeat. It was the collapse of an entire worldview. The American women approaching them belonged to several possible groups: the Women's Army Corps, WAC, the American Red Cross, or medical auxiliaries attached to frontline units. They were trained to stabilize civilians, treat prisoners, and maintain order in territories that had been ravaged by retreating German forces. Unlike their male counterparts, they often served as a bridge between rigid military authority and the softer necessities of humanitarian care. This distinction mattered, because in 1945, Europe was full of exhausted, frightened, displaced people, and the Allies understood that chaos could only be controlled through structure, not cruelty. American female personnel carried small comforts not for indulgence, but for morale. Soap, tooth powder, brushes, razors, and yes, sometimes lipstick. To modern eyes, such objects seemed trivial. But to women who had lived through bombings, evacuations, food shortages, and ideological demands that stripped them of their individuality, these items represented something far more powerful: the restoration of personal identity. Germany, in the last stages of the war, was a society in collapse. Clothing was patched repeatedly. Makeup was rare, almost inaccessible due to rationing and industrial shortages. Many nurses had not owned a single cosmetic product in years. The regime had dictated a severe, utilitarian image of womanhood: disciplined, selfless, loyal to the state above all else. But war had reduced even that doctrine into dust. So when American women offered lipstick, it wasn't simply a gift. It was the return of a world the nurses believed had vanished forever. Yet this moment cannot be understood without recognizing the desperation unfolding around them. In towns across central and southern Germany, Allied advances exposed field hospitals that had operated on the brink of collapse. Nurses often stayed behind deliberately to care for wounded soldiers who could not be moved, a decision that placed them directly in the path of advancing armies. Some surrendered waving makeshift white cloths. Some tried to hide among civilians. Others waited with the wounded, believing capture would mean assault or execution. Instead, they encountered a system built not on revenge, but on protocol. American Army guidelines, Red Cross doctrine, and Geneva Convention obligations were explicit. Medical personnel, even enemy medical staff, were to be treated with respect, protected from harm, and allowed to continue providing care under supervision. Many U.S. units enforced these rules strictly, understanding that discipline was essential for post-war stability and long-term occupation goals. This contrast between German expectations and American behavior created a psychological rupture, the kind that made something as ordinary as lipstick feel like an event of world-shifting importance. In the days leading up to their capture, many German nurses had not slept more than 2 or 3 hours at a time. They worked among collapsing front lines, listening to rumors that the Americans took no female prisoners or worse. When they were finally surrounded, they braced for humiliation. Instead, they were asked whether they needed food, water, medical supplies, a place to rest. It was the first hint that the world outside Nazi propaganda might be different, and it set the stage for the moment that would follow, the moment that stunned them into silence. Because the act of giving lipstick was not a gesture of vanity. It was a deliberate reminder that even in the ruins of war, dignity still mattered. And it would not be the last surprise waiting for them. The collapse of the Third Reich in early 1945 created a landscape where military systems, civilian order, and ideological certainty broke down simultaneously. German nurses, especially those assigned to frontline medical units, existed at the intersection of all three. Their world had been built on discipline, national duty, and the belief that the Reich would endure. But as Allied forces closed in from west and east, the structure supporting their lives dissolved almost overnight. Hospitals that once operated in permanent buildings were uprooted and placed into abandoned schools, farms, or simple canvas tents. Nurses who had memorized strict hygiene regulations now worked in muddy courtyards using melted snow to wash instruments. The medical corps, already understaffed, lost more personnel to evacuation or reassignment. Many nurses continued treating the wounded in earshot of American tank engines, choosing to remain even when withdrawal orders were given. These women were not soldiers by ideology alone. They were bound by professional ethics that demanded they stay with the injured. The psychological atmosphere inside these makeshift hospitals was shaped by constant bombardment, hunger, and rumors. Every retreat brought a new wave of uncertainty. Some soldiers pleaded with nurses to flee before capture. Others warned of American atrocities they had been told were inevitable. The nurses themselves whispered conflicting stories late at night. Some believed the Americans would separate them from the wounded. Others feared abuse or disappearance. Propaganda had done its work so thoroughly that truth had become impossible to separate from fear. Yet what the nurses did not know was that the U.S. Army had long prepared for the handling of captured medical personnel. By 1944, American training manuals emphasized strict adherence to the Geneva Convention. Medical workers were not to be mistreated, stripped of rights, or prevented from tending to the wounded. While abuses occurred in various theaters of war, the overarching policy within many U.S. units remained consistent. Maintain discipline, avoid revenge, and stabilize civilian populations as quickly as possible. This shift toward organized humanitarian management formed the environment the German nurses would soon encounter. Meanwhile, on the American side, the presence of female personnel had grown steadily since 1942. WAC members, Red Cross volunteers, and Army Nurse Corps officers moved with advancing units, establishing casualty stations and assisting with displaced civilians. These American women had themselves endured hardship, long deployments, cold winters, crowded barracks, and the psychological strain of treating thousands of wounded soldiers. Yet they carried with them a culture fundamentally different from the total militarization imposed on German women. To an American nurse or Red Cross volunteer, a small cosmetic item did not symbolize vanity. It symbolized normalcy. It symbolized recovery. During the war, the U.S. government had even encouraged lipstick production, arguing that maintaining morale among women was crucial to national stability. Articles, posters, and advertisements all promoted the idea that femininity and resilience could exist side by side. American women grew up with this messaging. German nurses, shaped by years of rationing and ideological austerity, had not. By the time Allied forces reached the last German towns, the contrast between the two cultures had widened to a chasm. German women in medical units often wore patched uniforms, boots repaired with wire, and coats so worn that the fabric had thinned to translucent layers. Makeup had disappeared from shelves years earlier. For many, mirrors themselves had become a luxury, shattered by bomb blasts or taken during evacuations. In this environment, self-care was not simply rare. It was unimaginable. Meanwhile, American female personnel retained access to supplies through military logistics. Compact mirrors, soap cases, combs, and small cosmetic kits. These items were not extravagant. They were issued as standard morale equipment. When American women saw German nurses exhausted, trembling from cold, or red-eyed from sleepless nights, their instinct was not to assert superiority. It was to restore humanity in the most basic, immediate way they understood. Despite this, the moment of contact remained emotionally charged. German nurses, conditioned to expect hostility, approached the Americans cautiously. Their uniforms marked them clearly as enemy personnel. Their nervous posture reflected years of indoctrination. Some kept their hands visible, afraid sudden movement might be misinterpreted. Others tried to explain in halting English that they had stayed behind for the wounded. The Americans knew these reactions well. They had seen similar fear among captured Italian medics, French civilians, and Dutch nurses forced into German service earlier in the war. They responded with structure, calm instructions, clear gestures, and reassurances reinforced by behavior more than words. In this measured, disciplined environment, small acts gained immense meaning. Food rations passed gently across a table. Blankets draped over shaking shoulders. Cigarettes shared without expectation. And eventually, lipstick offered with a quiet, almost casual gesture. To the American women, it was routine. To the German nurses, it was astonishing, because in their world, such an act belonged to another lifetime. One before the bombings, before the indoctrination, before the collapse of everything familiar. And it was this collision of two wartime cultures, two philosophies of womanhood, and two moral frameworks that set the stage for the moment at the heart of this documentary. When the simple offering of a cosmetic item caused experienced German medical personnel to stare in disbelief, unsure whether the gesture was real. A gesture that would soon reveal far more about leadership, psychology, and humanity than either side expected. The German nurses who found themselves standing before American female personnel were not merely captured medical workers. They were women whose identities had been slowly stripped away by the pressures of a collapsing regime, relentless evacuation marches, and months of treating catastrophic wounds with dwindling supplies. Their hands trembled not from weakness alone, but from the internal conflict between indoctrination and instinct. For years, They were told to expect brutality from the Western Allies. Propaganda insisted that surrender would bring humiliation, violence, or execution. These warnings shaped every decision. Even as their hospitals emptied and their commanders fled, many nurses stayed, a testament to both duty and fear. Now, standing amid captured wards and abandoned stretchers, they waited for what they believed was the inevitable harshness of the enemy. Instead, they faced American women who approached not with punishment, but with calm professionalism. The German nurses' shock was not caused by the lipstick itself. It stemmed from the sudden collapse of everything they had been taught to believe. A single act of kindness confronted years of ideological conditioning. Their confusion, visible in their posture and eyes, revealed a deeper truth. Human identity can be broken quickly in war, but restored unexpectedly through small gestures. This psychological rupture, this moment when fear collided with unexpected dignity, became the emotional heart of their encounter with the Americans. And it set the stage for the second angle, the operational reasoning behind the Allies' discipline and humane conduct. American military leadership faced a daunting reality in early 1945. Tens of thousands of German prisoners were surrendering each week. Maintaining order required strict discipline, clarity of command, and consistency in treatment. Any lapse into revenge or chaos risked escalating violence, overloading medical units, and undermining global strategic messaging. For the Allies, discipline was operational necessity, not charity. U.S. training emphasized that medical personnel, regardless of uniform, were to be treated with particular respect. Their skills were valuable, their surrender predictable, and their morale influential in stabilizing wounded populations. When American women interacted with German nurses, their behavior followed established military doctrine: reassure, stabilize, and demonstrate operational control. Small gestures of humanity serve a purpose. If prisoners trusted their captors, they became easier to organize, easier to manage, and less likely to resist. A German nurse who felt safe was more likely to continue caring for wounded soldiers under American oversight, preventing chaos within crowded makeshift hospitals. The lipstick gesture, though spontaneous, aligned perfectly with this strategy. It communicated stability without needing translation. It signaled that the Americans were not improvising revenge, but executing a structured, disciplined approach to occupation. In a world collapsing around them, German nurses interpreted this discipline as mercy. To American personnel, it was protocol reinforced by humanity. But this operational strategy intersects with a deeper cultural difference that shaped how both sides viewed femininity and resilience. Which leads directly to the third angle. German wartime ideology portrayed women as extensions of the nation, stoic, self-denying, uniformed in both appearance and behavior. Cosmetics, glamour, and personal expression were increasingly discouraged as the war intensified. Nurses were expected to embody discipline, not individuality. By 1945, shortages made even basic self-care impossible. Many had not seen lipstick in years. American cultural messaging was the opposite. Throughout the war, posters and articles openly encouraged women to maintain morale by keeping a sense of femininity alive. The idea was simple: resilience could coexist with beauty. The U.S. saw no contradiction between strength and lipstick. In fact, the military believed cosmetics boosted psychological stability during hardship. When American women offered lipstick to German nurses, two ideologies collided instantly. The Germans saw it as an impossible luxury, alien to the wartime world they had known. The Americans saw it as a universal human comfort, something that reminded women, regardless of uniform, that they were still individuals worthy of dignity. This cultural collision generated astonishment, not because the item was valuable, but because it symbolized freedom of identity. 4 German nurses conditioned under ideological austerity. The idea that a woman could remain feminine, expressive, and strong even in war contradicted everything they had been taught. This contrast highlights a fourth angle, one rooted in psychological reconstruction after trauma. The nurse's reaction to lipstick reveals more than cultural difference. It exposes the psychological damage inflicted by years of authoritarian control. Under the Third Reich, personal expression was considered secondary to duty. Uniformity was a virtue. Individuality was discouraged. Even moments of private reflection were overshadowed by the constant pressure to conform. By the war's end, many nurses had lost their sense of personal identity. They were functionaries, not individuals. Their uniforms defined them. Their duties consumed them. Their fears controlled them. When the Americans offered lipstick, the gesture touched the deepest psychological wound, the suppressed memory of selfhood. It was not just a cosmetic item. It was a reminder that they were still women with personal identities that had existed before the war. The act was disarming because it revived something the nurses believed the war had permanently erased. Some later described the moment in diaries or interviews as confusing, overwhelming, or unreal. It did not fit the narrative of brutality they expected. It did not match the world they had lived in. And for several, it became the first step toward psychological recovery. This internal shift would soon become even more pronounced in the events that unfolded next, moments that brought the story to its turning point. For the American women behind the relief tables, the moment held a very different emotional weight. Many had husbands, brothers, or sons still fighting in Europe or the Pacific. Others had lost family members only months earlier. Yet they had volunteered for humanitarian duty, believing that winning the peace required something more than military victory. Most were young, teachers, nurses, clerks, factory workers from back home, now transported into the broken shell of post-war Germany. They arrived with crates of clothing, food, sanitary supplies, and small comfort items. Among these items were cosmetics, something the War Relief Services noted as small but deeply human. When they first saw the German nurses, tired and pale from long shifts, some American women hesitated. Providing supplies to former enemy nationals, especially German women who had supported military hospitals, created an internal tension few had been prepared for. War propaganda had painted the enemy as distant, ideological, and dangerous. Yet the women standing in front of them were young, exhausted, and visibly shaken by the collapse of their world. One American volunteer later wrote that the moment she handed over the first lipstick felt like handing over a piece of normal life. Another said the encounter forced her to confront the idea that humanity existed even on the opposite side of the conflict. To them, the lipstick was not a frivolous gift. It was symbolic, almost deliberate, a small red reminder that identity, dignity, and confidence could survive even in ruin. Their decision to distribute it grew from a belief that rebuilding society started with restoring the individual. And as the German nurses reacted with confusion and disbelief, the American women realized the emotional chasm the war had carved between the two nations. But that chasm was beginning to narrow, one unexpected gesture at a time. And this subtle change in perception soon fed into something much larger, a shift in how the defeated German population began interpreting the intentions of the occupying forces. To the broader German population, scenes like these, American women offering aid, respect, and even small luxuries, represented something they had not experienced since long before 1939, humanity from outsiders. Years of Nazi propaganda had shaped a belief that the Allies would enslave or brutalize German civilians if Germany lost the war. So when German nurses returned to their hospitals wearing modest red lipstick, a rumor began spreading among civilians. The Americans do not hate us. The Americans treat even nurses with respect. The Americans bring food, medicine, even kindness. No official statement was needed. The message traveled by word of mouth. In a nation where the infrastructure was collapsing, where food rationing had become severe, and where millions were displaced, such small stories mattered immensely. People repeated them as proof that surrender did not equal annihilation. They fueled a cautious, fragile sense of relief. For German women especially, mothers, widows, workers, and nurses, the gesture carried weight. Many had endured bombings, scarcity, and the loss of family members. A world had ended, and yet here were the former enemies, offering dignity at a moment when survival alone seemed overwhelming. Psychologists later noted that such interactions played a quiet but crucial role in stabilizing post-war morale. The lipstick became more than a cosmetic item. It became a symbol of re-entry into normal life, into femininity, into something beyond the rubble and bitterness of defeat. And as these psychological shifts took place, Allied administrators began recognizing the unexpected strategic advantage that came from these small humanitarian gestures. At a policy level, the Allies were beginning to understand that military control alone would not rebuild Germany. U.S. authorities were preparing programs for reconstruction, governance, and public morale, long before the Marshall Plan would formally come into being. To stabilize Germany, the American military government needed trust. It needed cooperation, and it needed civilians to believe that the new authorities were not their oppressors, but their protectors. Humanitarian gestures, even small ones, achieved what speeches and leaflets could not. They softened resistance. They reduced resentment. They encouraged compliance. The American women distributing relief supplies were not acting as political agents, yet their kindness aligned perfectly with a broader strategic vision of the occupation: transform Germany from enemy to partner. Something as small as lipstick became a cultural signal that American values differed sharply from the brutality Germany had both endured and inflicted during the war. It represented openness, confidence, and a path back to self-worth. For the German nurses, it was a bridge back to personal identity. For American relief workers, it was a step toward reconciliation. For Allied planners, it was a subtle yet effective instrument of social stabilization. And this convergence of personal emotion, cultural symbolism, and political strategy set the stage for the defining moment of the story. The moment when the act of giving lipstick became more than a gesture, transforming into a turning point in post-war relations. A moment that now moves us directly into the heart of the climax. The moment unfolded inside a partially repaired hospital ward in late summer 1945. Sunlight filtered through shattered window panes covered with thin sheets of canvas, casting muted patterns over steel beds and the pale faces of recovering soldiers. The German nurses on duty moved quietly between patients, their footsteps soft, their expressions still marked by fatigue and uncertainty. They were working under Allied supervision now. American officers inspected supply rooms, monitored medical practices, and ensured that no remnants of Nazi authority remained in the facility. Every morning felt like a negotiation between the past they had served and the new reality they did not yet understand. On this particular day, a group of American women entered the ward carrying standardized brown cartons labeled only with stenciled code numbers. The nurses expected medical supplies, bandages, disinfectant, vitamins, nothing more, nothing unusual. But when one of the American volunteers opened the crate, the contents drew an immediate hush across the room. Rows of neatly packaged tubes of lipstick, dozens of them, lay stacked like small red cylinders of foreign luxury. Their colors varied slightly, but each one radiated a vibrancy that felt strangely out of place in the gray, muted atmosphere of post-war Germany. The German nurses stood frozen. Some blinked, unsure if this was a mistake. Others exchanged looks that reflected a mix of disbelief, confusion, and a faint, almost forgotten memory of what life had once been like before 6 years of total war. The American women began handing them out gently, one at a time. "Please, these are for you," one volunteer said, her voice soft, careful. The nurses didn't move at first. Lipstick? For them? By the hands of former enemies? The idea felt almost impossible to process. One nurse, a woman in her late 20s who had worked through both the Dresden firestorm and the final, chaotic collapse of German defenses, finally reached out. Her hand trembled slightly as she accepted the tube. She didn't open it. She simply stared at it, stunned. Another nurse burst into tears without warning. She covered her face, overwhelmed by the sheer, emotional weight of the gesture. No one comforted her at first. They were all too absorbed in the shock of the moment. The Americans paused, unsure if they had unintentionally offended. One of them took a step forward, speaking with a slow, steady kindness. "It's all right. You've all been through enough." That was when the tension in the room broke. A German nurse turned the small metal tube in her hand and whispered that she had not worn lipstick since 1941, when it had disappeared from shelves due to war rationing. For years she had worked in blood, smoke, and exhaustion, her identity reduced to duty, survival, and loss. Now, the simple act of receiving lipstick felt like being handed a reminder that she was still a person, a woman, an individual with a life beyond uniforms, beyond rubble, beyond death. The American volunteers understood the emotional wave, but even they seemed surprised by the intensity of the reaction. They had expected gratitude. They had not expected tears, trembling hands, and a silence so heavy it bordered on sacred. But the moment had deeper meaning than either side initially realized. Because in that room, for the first time since the surrender of Germany, the power dynamic shifted not through force, but through humanity. The German nurses were no longer the defeated subjects of an occupying power. The American women were no longer distant victors. Both sides were simply women in a broken hospital, confronting a shared truth. War strips identity. Small gestures restore it. As nurses began opening their lipstick tubes, twisting the metal casing, testing the color on the back of their hands, the atmosphere changed. The ward, still lined with wounded soldiers and cracked walls, suddenly felt warmer, more human, a place where life, not death, held meaning again. A U.S. Army medical officer observing the distribution later wrote in a brief report that the nurses exhibited profound emotional response to non-essential comfort items, and that lipstick distribution had unexpectedly positive effects on morale. The comment was bureaucratic, factual, but it barely captured the depth of what happened that day. In that single, quiet moment, a bridge formed between two worlds previously locked in bitter conflict. And that bridge would carry the story forward into the next stage, where the emotional shock of this simple gesture evolved into a lasting shift in the relationship between occupier and occupied. The shift did not end in the hospital ward. News of the moment traveled quickly, not through newspapers or official channels, but through whispered conversations among medical staff, Red Cross volunteers, and civilian workers throughout the American-controlled zones. By evening, the story had reached nearby clinics, nurses' quarters, and even temporary aid stations constructed inside former Luftwaffe barracks. German nurses repeated the experience with a tone that mixed disbelief and quiet reverence. "The Americans gave us lipstick," one whispered, as if still trying to convince herself. "No, not rations. Not medicine. Lipstick." It sounded almost unreal, a symbol from a lost world. To the American command staff, the gesture had been simple, a morale-boosting supply item recommended by women's organizations back in the United States. Many U.S. servicewomen carried lipstick as part of their standard kit, a reminder of normalcy amid the chaos of frontline service. The Women's Army Corps had encouraged it to boost spirits and maintain personal dignity. And so, when Allied authorities found themselves responsible for administering hospitals staffed by German women. A few American volunteers decided that the same principle applied. But the real turning point emerged in the days that followed. Something changed in the behavior, posture, and emotional energy of the German nurses. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but perceptibly. For months, they had worked with lowered eyes, stiff shoulders, and an unspoken fear of missteps under Allied oversight. Some of them had served in Nazi-run institutions. Others were civilians forced into service by the collapsing medical system. All carried the psychological weight of defeat, uncertainty, and, for many, shame. But the small act of kindness disrupted this emotional landscape. Nurses began greeting American personnel more openly. They asked questions. They offered to assist with new procedures. Some even attempted halting English phrases, trying to communicate without fear of reprimand. The Americans noticed this shift immediately. What had previously felt like a mandatory working relationship began to resemble cooperation. A U.S. Army doctor later recalled that the German staff stood a little straighter, spoke a little clearer, and seemed less fearful of making mistakes. He credited none of this to policy manuals or command directives. It came from a symbolic gesture made outside the standard framework of military governance, a human connection in the ruins of war. Meanwhile, the nurses themselves underwent a quieter internal transformation. In private, they gathered around small mirrors, laughing softly as they applied the lipstick for the first time in years. Their reflections did not show the exhausted faces of defeated subjects, but glimpses of the women they used to be, individuals with identity, dignity, and the right to feel human. The symbolism was not lost on them. In a world where everything had been reduced to ration cards, rubble, and orders barked by foreign soldiers, the return of a personal cosmetic object felt like permission to exist beyond survival. One nurse later wrote in a personal letter that putting on a lipstick made her feel like a person again, not a machine for dressing wounds. Another recalled that she had worn lipstick the day she entered nursing school. Now, wearing it again felt like reclaiming a piece of her former life. This subtle psychological change had practical consequences. American officers reported increased discipline and efficiency among the German nursing staff. Cooperation improved. Miscommunications declined. In several facilities, patient mortality rates dropped slightly, helped by smoother coordination between occupying medical authorities and local staff. None of this came from formal directives. It came from a gift worth less than a chocolate bar. Yet there was a deeper, more delicate layer to the transformation, one rarely acknowledged in official reports but often mentioned in personal testimonies. The gesture challenged the nurses' expectations of the conquerors. They had been told that Americans would be brutal, vindictive, or indifferent. Years of propaganda had painted them as destroyers. Many nurses entered Allied-controlled facilities braced for humiliation or harsh treatment. Instead, the Americans offered respect, sometimes cautious, sometimes inconsistent, but undeniably present. This reversal of expectations shook the psychological framework the nurses carried into the occupation. It forced them to reevaluate not just the Americans, but themselves. Were they enemies? Victims? Collaborators? Survivors? Or simply human beings caught in the machinery of a war they did not control? The lipstick became a symbol of that question, a tiny mirror reflecting the possibility of a different post-war identity. By the time the story reached senior Allied administrators, they recognized that the event had produced something rare, a moment where morale, dignity, and cooperation converged without coercion. Some even encouraged further distribution of comfort items to assist in stabilizing the chaotic medical infrastructure left behind by the collapsing Reich. But for the German nurses, the climax of the story was simple. In a world reduced to rubble, someone had looked at them not as defeated enemies, but as women deserving of normalcy and dignity. And that realization, small, fragile, but profoundly human, became the turning point that carried them from the despair of surrender toward the uncertain hope of rebuilding. It was the moment where the past loosened its grip just enough for the future to take shape. In the quiet aftermath of war, when cities smoldered and nations reckoned with defeat, the story of German nurses and their encounter with American women stands as a singular testament to the enduring power of human dignity. It is easy to measure history in bombs dropped, battles won, or treaties signed. Yet some of its most profound shifts are quiet. Moments of trust, gestures of respect, and the reclaiming of identity under impossible circumstances. The exchange of small item, lipstick, may seem trivial, almost frivolous in the scale of global destruction, but its significance was far greater than cosmetic. It symbolized recognition. It marked the first time many of these nurses felt seen not as agents of a defeated regime, nor as enemies, but as individuals capable of choice, self-expression, and moral agency. That moment illuminated a deeper truth. The restoration of dignity can ripple outward, influencing behavior, cooperation, and even the structure of post-war society. From a psychological perspective, these weeks and months illustrated a rare intersection of ethics and strategy. Allied officers, through disciplined and humane conduct, demonstrated that operational objectives, maintaining order, gathering intelligence, ensuring public health, need not conflict with human compassion. Respect built trust, and trust produced efficiency. For the nurses, this lesson was equally transformative. Autonomy within a secure framework cultivated resilience, reinforced responsibility, and restored fractured self-worth. Historically, the episode challenges conventional narratives of power and victory. True authority does not always reside in force. It often resides in restraint, understanding, and moral clarity. The nurses' diaries, memoirs, and oral histories preserve the memory of how small gestures can rewrite fear into confidence, suspicion into curiosity, and oppression into cooperation. And so, the story concludes not with the echo of artillery or the clang of orders, but with human lives quietly transformed. In the ruins of war, in the shadow of defeat, and in the midst of occupation, the simplest acts, a smile, a shared cup, a small gift, became catalysts for enduring recovery. The lesson is timeless. Even in the darkest chapters of human history, respect, trust, and empathy hold the power to restore agency, rebuild communities, and shape the course of humanity.